videos,
Right.
and I noticed it today too.
Right. What I'm doing on this one, I'm going to record it locally, and then I'll upload it to YouTube, which is what I've done in the past to address that very problem. So the experience may be a little sketchy for this, but hopefully will be better, um, so that you can watch the recording. So hopefully that makes
Okay.
sense. So today I'll be talking about getting Hadoop installed inside of WSL2, so Windows Subsystem for Linux. As a review, if you haven't already done so, get WSL2 installed first. And again, to frame the context, the idea of deliverable 2 is to have uh, Hadoop installed and configured somewhere. The course assignments talk about doing so inside of HD Insight. HD Insight is an Azure service for cloud-based Hadoop. The problem with it is it's quite expensive, and it's also a bit problematic in some regards because it can be tricky to get set up as well, right? So that's the basic idea. Let me go ahead and just for fun, I'll double record this just to be on the safe side. So again, if you haven't already done so, install WSL2, go to the Microsoft Store, search for probably Ubuntu 18.04 is the one that I'll be using, uh, and it's the one I've had the most luck with. You can get them all to work. It's a matter of subtleties and differences in the scripts, right? So once you've got it installed, you'll want to launch it. Uh, It'll initially take a little bit to do some configuration. It's going and creating a virtual hard drive essentially, and then you're asked to give it a Unix username and password, and just make sure that you make a note of those because you'll need them later on. So I've done something similar inside of this shell. I had to go through a few extra hoops because I did a backup and restore of the WSL image, got it off of my operating system drive onto a separate drive. That process seems to lose the identity that you created so that it doesn't necessarily run that way. There's probably some configuration I'm not doing that would fix that. A workaround, since the user exists, is to essentially run as that user. So that's what the first line you see on the screen is doing. I'm doing an SU and then a dash L. I guess it's in the middle of the page. And then the name of the user I want to run as. From that point on, you can see that my prompt changed from root at my desktop to my name at my desktop. So I'm now running as myself rather than as root. That's important because if you install Hadoop or try to and try to run it as root, uh, it won't let you. So keep that in mind. So that's an important thing to do. So to make this process a bit simpler, I've created out on a GitHub repository a script that makes life a little easier, and you essentially can use that to make it to where you can get it up and running a bit quicker. It also includes some files that have modified configuration files of Hadoop to make life a little easier as well. So one of the things you might want to do is clone that someplace locally. I'm opening up a command prompt. I'm switching over to a drive. I'm going into users. I'm making a directory called git. I'm going into it, and I'm doing a git clone in the URL. Oh, and it, some reason, uh, did an extra line. So I'm doing a clone of my repo locally. That's basically just taking everything in that GitHub repository, pulling it down onto my local drive so that I can take a look at it. Note that this is inside of a DOS command prompt or command shell, a Windows command shell. It's not inside of WSL. taking a little bit because there's some additional stuff in there besides just the script. So while that's finishing, one of the things that we'll need to do is get a copy of Hadoop. The approach that you might want to use is to go to the hadoop.apache.org website, and I'll go ahead and just type that in. And it auto-completed, so helpful. And then click on download and figure out what version you want to use. In this case, it's the most current is 3.3.1. I'm going to actually use 3.3.0 because that's what my script uses, but you can certainly change it to 3.3.1 if you're so inclined. But what you end up doing is to download it, you'll do one of these binary downloads. And it's going to redirect you essentially to a mirror of some sort. And what you want to do is copy that link address, and then inside of the easiest way is inside of your WSL prompt, you'll do a wget -nce for no clobber and give it that URL. And if you do that, what that'll do is pull that file into the local directory so that you can then do stuff with it, like extract it. Because I don't want to wait around for that to finish, I've actually already copied a version of it into this folder so that we can use it instead. Making sense so far, and hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, much better
Okay.
this time.
Okay, so we've now cloned that file or directory. I'm going into the Hadoop folder. And I'm going to just open up Visual Studio Code in this directory. And this is on, again, inside of Windows. I'm using VS Code just because it's a nice, easy one to use. Through Hadoop install.sh. You can't really run that directly. That was what I was hoping for when I was writing it, is to basically just have a script that you run that does the whole installation. Don't really need to go into the details of why, but the short answer is it's harder than you might think. So the first thing that is recommended, and this is all coming, it's not something I made up, it's taken from this page, Hadoop setting up a single node cluster, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here, is set up a pseudo-distributed Hadoop cluster. And the reason being is, for what we're doing in this course, it's about the concepts more so than it is the actual trying to process data at scale, right? So a single node cluster is perfectly fine, and all I've done is taken the various instructions inside of here and work on trying to get them to actually work in hopefully a repeatable fashion. We'll see how well I succeeded in that here as we go through this. The first thing you'll want to do is a sudo update. And sudo is just stands for super user do, right? So it's basically running as an elevated permission. In this case, it's running as essentially root to update the system. That's literally, we're updating all of the packages that are installed and making sure that they're up to date. And so that's what the first step is to, it's almost like doing a Windows update to make sure that you're running the most recent versions of Windows, right? The intent is to do things like remove any kind of vulnerabilities and so on, right? So that's what this is doing. And shifting back to the PowerPoint, a similar sort of thing. Go through sudo update, and then we're going to do some variations. Instead of the --assume -yes, we use a -y. I think this actually works maybe in the newer version in 20. It doesn't seem to work too well in 18. So, and I'll kind of shift back and forth between the PowerPoint and the script I wrote. The next version is to go through, or the next step in this operation is to install essentially Java. We start off by installing the default JRE, make sure that it's up to date. Then install OpenJDK, OpenJDK JRE headless, and then OpenJDK 8, and check and see what version of Java we're running and which Java instance is being used. The next part is kind of, in some ways, the most challenging. What we have to do is be able to SSH to localhost. SSH, if you're not familiar with it, is a command line interactive terminal, if you will. It's very similar in nature to Telnet, which is a pretty old technology for connecting to command line environments, executing commands and getting back results. SSH, the same concept, except it looks a lot like a shell. One of the things that I've consistently found challenging is to get this work. It's needed because inside of Hadoop, it expects you to use SSH to talk to Hadoop. The reason being, even though we're running this on a single box VM, basically, or a single node cluster, Hadoop is intended to be a distributed process, a distributed processing environment. And the way that it talks amongst itself is through SSH. The thing I found the best to do is to start off by removing OpenSSH server, then turn around and install it again. So take it off, put it back on, and then run this keygen step to produce an ID for enabling a local connection, and then take that key, add it to the list of authorized keys once it finishes. Oops, missed that bit. So it didn't actually run keygen yet. Let's do that again. So we actually get a key, and that's the fingerprint for it. Copy that, and that's what this cat command is doing, is it's taking the contents of that pub file, pushing it over into a file that's inside of the root directory for this user, so the home directory, in a folder called .ssh, a file named authorized keys. And that the cat is basically just a way of concatenating something to something, right? So we're basically adding two files together. It's kind of the way you have to do it in the Linux world. And then the last thing is to change that authorized keys attribute using the change mod command to 0600. And then we start it, and with any luck, we're able to then SSH to localhost. And it says, I don't know this server. Do you want to let me go? Let us go to it. And I say, sure, and save the fingerprint for future reference. It looks like we're in the same shell, right? Because it looks basically the same, but this is actually an SSH shell on the same box. So it's like telnetting to yourself, so to speak. I exit out of it and I'm back into the shell that I used to launch it. So the one that we first started with. That's a good sign, right? So now I'm able to SSH to the local host. That's important because if you don't get that step working, there's no point in going forward because you won't be able to get the whole thing up and running. So the next step is to actually go out and get the Hadoop distribution. The command you can use is this wget, just like I mentioned earlier, -nc. The nc means no clobber. What that means is if the file exists, it doesn't get it. So in this case, because it's already there, I can go ahead and run that command. Again, this is 3.3.0, perfectly fine to use for this assignment. If you want the enjoyment of doing something different, you can go to 3.3.1. I don't think there's a whole lot of difference. This is the kind of the next key step, is to take this file that exists. So we've got this Hadoop -3.3.0.tar.gz. That's a compressed tar file. Tar files are nothing more than a container that contains a bunch of files, and then they're compressed to save space. Same basic concept as a zip, right? So, or an R, a RAR file. So it's the same concept. What we want to do then is extract the contents of that file into a folder so we can actually access it. And that's what the command I just executed does, which is tar, and then I used these options. they may not be exactly the minimum that could work, but it certainly works. Minus X, Z, V, and F, and then the name of the tar GZ file. At the end of that, you can see that it spewed a bunch of files that it created. And if we do another ls, which is the same basic thing as directory, or ls minus LA, which gives us longer version, including the hidden files, you can see there's now a directory in that first column where it says D. That means it's a directory that exists that's called Hadoop dash 3.3.0. Also, note I did not run a sudo tar command, right? So this is just tar minus xv or xzvf. If you do it as sudo, what'll happen is the folder will be created. You won't be able to do much with it because you're not going to be a super user most of the time. So don't do that. The reason I know that is because I did it and it didn't work out for me. So don't do a sudo. Your next step is to basically see what directory you're in. In this case, we are in home, and then switch into that Hadoop directory we just created. And inside of that directory, you should see a list of other files and directories, and importantly, you'll see a bin and an S bin, and also probably underneath there's some more things. So the thing that you want to do now is go into the etc folder, and inside of etc, there's a Hadoop folder, and that's where we'll do most of our work. So this is where we are in the script right now. We're down inside of the Hadoop etc folder, and if we want to see where we are, if you don't believe the command prompt, you can see that I'm in home, Allen, Hadoop -3.3.0, etc, and then Hadoop. Inside of that folder, there's several files that will be dealing with. And these are essentially controlling the configuration of Hadoop. And the default settings, as with most default settings, aren't what you really want. So what I've done to make your life a little easier is put the files in their end state that you want them configured to. So you can see here what I've added, and I'll show you that with a diff command. But you can pull them from that same Git repo that I created, or you could actually copy and paste them down if you wanted to, but this is pretty easy. So the first thing I do is make a backup copy of the files. So in this case, core-site.xml, I rename it to that .backup, and then I pull down from my repo the slightly modified version of core site. And then we can take a look at those. If I could type. And you can see the only real difference is the addition that I made of a property, and I set the name of that property to the default file system, and I tell it the default file system is localhost 9000. So that's basically, we're configuring it so that everything's on one box, everything's on localhost, and we're setting it up that way. The same process for the Hadoop site XML, create a backup, and then pull down the modified file. And again, you can see the thing I've added was a property that is setting the DFS replication to 1. So we're basically saying there's only 1 degree of replication that's necessary. That's because we're running on a single cluster. Or single node cluster. There's no reason to do any duplication. Then the Hadoop environment setup, same sort of thing. Make a backup. And in Linux, there's not really a rename command. Instead, you do a move to a new name. So I'm moving hadoop-env.sh to hadoop-env.sh.backup. And again, to take a look at what I've done, And all I really did was do an export of Java home. And that's what this is. So now we want to go, and this isn't necessary per se, but we're going to go back to our home folder. So in this case, I'm going to go back to my home. And you can do that by just typing CD and hit enter, or you can do CD and tilde. They do the same thing. And what we want to do is make some modifications to the profile. And the easiest way to do that is to use these echo commands. In echo, we're doing essentially some stream redirection here. So we're taking these lines and adding them to my profile. Something I've learned by doing this several times is that there's ways that you can do a source and whatnot to make the profile take root, so to speak. The easiest way is really to open up another session. And then since I've got some funniness going on, I have to do that. Can I remember? I'll just do it from memory. That always goes great. su-l Allen, and I'm back in as myself. And to make sure life is good, we're going to print this out. And this is an environment variable. Same sort of concept exists inside of Windows environment variables, inside of the shells. It's essentially a parameter, if you will, that can be referenced, and it contains configuration values, such as where is Hadoop, the Hadoop classes installed, and so on. So at this point, we actually have Hadoop installed. So the next step is to try to run it. We don't necessarily need to do all these because we did them back here. And I'm double checking myself. We've got Java home, Hadoop home, path. Hadoop conf directory. And then we add Java home to the path. Bin, yep. So with that, we can go over to try to start this. There's several ways to do this. Just to be on the safe side, we'll start off doing a JPS and see if anything is actually running, and it's not. It's equivalent to a PS, which gives you the process status, and this is JPS is going to be the Java process status. So we'll start off by, even though nothing is running, we're going to say stop everything. Then we need to essentially format our name node once this finishes. And what that's doing, and I'm making sure it actually worked. It looks as though it did, is essentially formatting HDFS, right? So if all went to plan, we'll go ahead and start Hadoop. And I'm actually kicking off everything. Kind of overkill. You don't necessarily need everything, but I'm running all of Hadoop, not just the minimal sort of services that might be necessary. So it's doing things like starting up the name node, the data nodes, and so on. And then we'll go into, although this isn't really necessary as well, we're in the Hadoop folder. And then, even though I really didn't need to do that, because the next step is to go through and actually issue some commands. All right, so that's always fun. So it's telling me the name node didn't actually get formatted correctly. And I've ran into this before. I'm trying to remember what I had to do to get it to work. All right, and it actually tells you that here. So the directory temp, Hadoop, Allen, DFS, and name is an inconsistent state, and we see that down here as well. So the obvious is to see if that exists. So the next thing to try is to create it, and then we'll try that again. And now it's telling us it's not formatted. So the next step is to do the format again. Helps if you can spell. While I'm figuring it out, any questions so far?
No.
So did you see anything that differed from what you had done?
Um, I feel like I'm missing a couple of the steps.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, because of the directories that we were going back and forth. I think I have just
You may not have been in the etc folder. That may have been where you. So whenever we switched, where did code go? Okay. Whenever you're doing the actual Hadoop installation, getting into the thing that you might have missed is this switching into, I'm trying to find it, etc Hadoop. So underneath of the Hadoop
yeah,
distribution. Yeah.
I might have missed that. Because when I go to etc folder and when I type in Hadoop, it doesn't work. It says it will show me the directory, it show me the stuff in it, but it doesn't work. It says just no command. I mean, bad command.
Yeah. Yeah. You to get it to where you can actually, I think that's actually working. Sorry, I wanted to, it's always challenging.
No, that's all right.
Yeah.
I'll let you finish first.
Okay. Let's stop all and start all again. So the key thing, you got to follow them all. And I'm the worst. I'm horrible at following directions. I don't make any pretense about it. Um, I lose focus and skip over steps, and so on. But with this, it's incredibly important to follow every step in the order. That's part of why I tried to write a script. My goal was to get something that we could actually just run. Open up a shell of WSL2 uh, and run the script, and it's done, and you've got Hadoop. That's what I was shooting for. Um, as you can see, that hasn't materialized just yet, right? So the getting into the right folders is the right one of the challenges. Also, if you added things like the Hadoop home um, environment variables and you added it to your path and so on, if you didn't either open up a new shell or basically do a source on your profile, then it's not going to take effect. It's kind of like in Windows, you have that same phenomena. If you add an environment variable, and it doesn't necessarily take effect in a shell unless you like start the shell over, right? So especially
Right.
if all you're doing is setting it in like a config file, right? So there's lots of ways it can go wrong. Sometimes you end up with some weirdness where it just doesn't seem to want to work. Um, I'm optimistic we're closer this time, but there's still getting the file system formatted is the next to the last step, because once you get the file system formatted, um, then you're most of the way there. Uh, the last step is to actually do the Hadoop or the word count. The way you do that is essentially pulling down, uh, probably just pull down the Java file from my repo, or if things don't go well, you can pull down the compiled version, which is the class file, then a text file, and you basically compile the Java code into a class file, or use the class file I give you, and then turn that into a jar using the jar command. A jar is kind of like a DLL, right? If you're not familiar with Java, it's a container that contains an executable. In this case, it contains an executable that is the word count class that we compile from the word count Java source file. And then the last step is to actually issue this Hadoop jar, give it the name of the jar that we just compiled, tell it what to do inside of that. In this case, we're going to run word count, give it an input and an output, and it produces the output from that input, counting the words that exist in each one across the pseudo cluster. It's not truly a cluster. So it's complaining. Yeah, because it's not running. But the key thing with this kind of stuff, to me, it is it's a perseverance to some extent, and it's probably the hardest thing in this course, is to get Hadoop installed up and running. And frankly, just do a few clicks in a web browser and you have a cluster. And Hadoop has not stayed up with that. So um, is it dash that or dash HDFS, dash ls? Oh, that. Okay, so we're close. Let's see if it'll let me make it. Okay, so this is another kind of important concept. I got past the name node not formatting by creating a directory that should have probably existed. But anyway, the next step is to essentially, once you format it, it's like formatting a disk drive. But HDFS is kind of, because it's a distributed file system, it's not the same as your Linux file system, and certainly not the same as the Windows file system. So you interact with it by using things like the HDFS command. And that's one of the module's goals, is for you to become familiar with how to interact with HDFS. So what I've just done is I've created a directory called user off of the sudo root. There's nothing inside of it right now because I just created it. But inside of it, I'm going to create two more folder, or another folder and then two folders under that, which is a folder that will be named the same as my username. So that's what whoami does. And so it'll create that folder. And if we take a look now of what's inside of it, inside of user, we see that there's now a folder named Alan, right? Which is my username. The next thing is to create underneath of Alan an input folder and an output folder. So if we take a look at inside of user, we see there's Alan. If we look underneath of user/Alan, we should see input and output, right? So we've basically created a tree-like structure. There's a root folder. Off of it, there's user. Underneath of user, there's Alan, and then there's two folders underneath Alan, input and output. So we've got Hadoop is up and running. We've got our name node formatted. HDFS is formatted. The next step is to go through and actually do this word count. So we'll go back to the root directory for this user, the home directory, which is the tilde. Again, I just hit CD or I did CD tilde, does the same stuff. And then the next step is to create a directory, call it word count or whatever. It really doesn't matter too much. We're going to create it and then we're going to switch into it. So we're now in a directory called word count, and I'm going to go grab some stuff. I'm going to start off and be optimistic and just grab the Java file. So this is what we just pulled down. And this is kind of the hello world of MapReduce, right? Word count literally does what the name implies. It takes a text file, kind of tokenizes it in a very simple way, counts the instances of each word. It's not very smart in this implementation. It's not ignoring case, or the delimiters are pretty crude, but that's what it does. Is it's just doing a string tokenizer, and then essentially I guess the important things from an understanding perspective. You have your mapper right up here. That's this function map, and this is the reduce. That's where MapReduce comes from. The whole concept is you have a mapper that you apply, then you reduce. There's some stuff that happens in between, but that's kind of the two pieces as a developer you need to know about. The last bit here is the main. So the main inside of a Java program is the entry point, accepts an array of strings, and potentially, in this case, doesn't return anything, but it may raise an exception. So your approach here is to create a configuration, and then you basically create a job from that configuration, which in this case is kind of a default thing. Then we set the jar by class. We do the mapper class, which is the tokenizer mapper. We do the combiner class, which is an int sum reducer, and so on. So we're basically wiring it up to the code that's up there as far as the mapper and the int sum reducer up here.
So basically, everything that you're doing right now is in your local, right?
I'm not in the cloud. I'm running inside of a Windows environment, but I'm running it inside of a Linux Ubuntu distribution, right? And that's all because I'm using that Windows subsystem for Linux. I'm not on Azure in any way. I'm all local to my device. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yep.
So the next part that it can go wrong, I'll go ahead and pull down the text file we're going to count. And this is the Summer's Day, William Shakespeare. Then I'm going to put that into the input folder on the HDFS instance. And then this is where the next chance for it to not work, because once we formatted the hard drive or the HDFS file system, the next bit where it can go wrong is trying to compile it, and we'll see if that works. And I've had this before where this is a configuration around Java, and probably Java pointing at the tools. That's part of why I went ahead and gave you the compiled version, because frankly it's kind of getting beyond what we really care about here. So I'm pulling down what would have been produced if that command had went well, the class file, right? So the way Java works is you've got a source Java file. It compiles to something called a class file, a .class, and then you take that .class file and package it up into a jar, which is what this command does. And if we take a look now, you'll see a wc.jar. And the jar, like I mentioned, is pretty close to being like a DLL. It is a program executable container. What we're going to do here is tell Hadoop to run that jar, and inside of it execute the word count program, and then give it, here's the input and here's the output. And with any luck, when we run that, it'll actually work. And of course, this time we get an exception. And I can tell that the class not found exception is because it's not finding probably the class home. So back here, I'm just going to run these because I'm not 100% sure I have all those. And then try it again. Still not working. But we're really close. The last bit of this, and I'm not going to debug this right now, the last bit is making sure that the essentially the files that Java needs to do its thing are in place. And in this case, it's not finding the word count dollar tokenizer. And the more root cause issue here is related to not being able to do the compilation. So at the point that this doesn't work, we're probably not going to actually count words. Although that time, oh no, let's get rid of, oh, try that again. That time it worked. Let's try that again then. Maybe it's just because it didn't actually compile it. Maybe that's an old class file. Oh, there we go. That's what it was. Okay, so to talk through what I did to make that work, right? It wasn't just hand waving. There was kind of a little bit of an informed thing. So what I did was these exports essentially make it where that variable is available. And it should have taken effect, assuming I did everything right in my install whenever I re-entered my shell. But obviously it did not, so that is, you want to run that, so don't skip those steps. Then the next step is to go through and actually compile it, um, uh, which is what we're doing inside of here. So we're actually calling this is actually Java-C is what's doing the compilation, right? So we're telling Hadoop to compile this Java file and produce a class file. We're taking that class file and then running it in Hadoop. So we're actually doing the map reduce, and to see what it did, the last step is to go and use this and I thought I had it in here. If I could only type. So this is the output of what it did, and it's a directory. And it's creating essentially a partition file by the number of, or the degree of parallelism. In this case, it's 0. So we can actually do cat, which is a way of typing out the contents. And you can see the actual counts of each of the words, and being the most frequent. But there's also, you can see the tokenizer is not real great, right? Because we have capital and we have lowercase and. So it's not normalizing to the consistent case. Also, you can see that punctuation is being included as part of the word rather than stripping those out. So um, this and this comma are two different things in its world, right? So not the best word count, but it is a word count. And with that, if you're able to reproduce those steps, then you've succeeded in this assignment. And that's exactly demonstrated putting a file into, or installing and configuring Hadoop MapReduce, putting a file into HDFS, and then running a program against it that reads from HDFS and writes to HDFS. So it is challenging, especially if you're like me and don't necessarily follow every instruction. But if you follow that script, and especially if you don't skip steps, and you use Ubuntu 18.04, then you're probably going to be good. Any other questions? And I'm probably not instilling confidence.
Um, no, uh, I think I missed a couple of steps, so I think I'm the same way that I'm having a hard time to follow the directions. So yeah, I'm gonna work on it tonight and make sure that I follow every step this time.
All right. Sounds good.
And yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate that for the third session.
Sure thing. No worries. All right. And thanks for joining. Always nice to have somebody in the room. For those watching the recording, if there is anyone, let me know if you have any questions. I don't know that anybody will be, but if you do, let me know. And if you get stuck, let me know as well, right? And we can diagnose something. As I mentioned earlier, once I go through all of the modules and deliverables in a course, sometimes I'll circle back and go through them a second time. Sometimes I just shift over and hold more office hours, right? And do things like diagnose if you're having challenges, what's going on, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, have a good evening. Thanks for joining. We'll talk probably on Wednesday.
Yep. You too. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. Goodbye.